So let's get started. And this serves to remind you once again that this session is recorded, so be conscious of that. But welcome all to another Buried in Treasures learning community. Um, and you may hear some noise in the background. I'm hoping that it wraps up quickly. Have a landscaper in my midst. Hopefully it doesn't cause too much disturbance. But today's Buried in Treasure, and for those who are new, or this is relatively early in your engagement with us, Buried in Treasure Learning Community is a monthly learning community really focused on helping people recognize and gain control over hoarding behaviors. As a group, we want to discuss information, best practices, and tools for self-help. And it's guided really by the book, the reference Buried in Treasure, Help for Compulsive Acquiring, Saving, and Hoarding. And it's really aimed to support the self-help, really harm reduction, in particular for people with hoarding behaviors. And it's really done on a group and individual scale. And the sessions are really interactive, and it really serves to apply the strategies and tools to the Buried in Treasure approach. It's really the evidence-based approach to really recognizing and managing efforts to declutter and to maximize one's opportunity to live in a way they would like to live, in spite of or subsequent to addressing the issue of clutter. It's kind of an overview for those who may be new to it. Anyone totally new to today's session, to our entire learning Buried in Treasure learning community? If so, just give me a heads up. Carla, you're new? You look familiar. So maybe that's it. You have a familiar face, but welcome, Carla. Glad to have you with us. So today's meeting is hosted by DBHR through the Washington State Healthcare Authority. And as I mentioned, this is an interactive meeting where we really want to really discuss not only your perspective, your experience, and how you see these particular strategies and skill being applicable to your day-to-day engagement with someone who may be experiencing hoarding as a major challenge. What's important is that the slides for this particular presentation and recording will be sent to you by email by DHR and Washington State Healthcare Authority. So let me know if you are not receiving those, or if you are. I'm hoping that that's consistent. And in some instances, some may be delayed, but just be patient with us. We're trying to get that information to you. So as you know, this is a series that are really monthly throughout the year. So it's 12-month engagement that really covers the whole basis of the hoarding and decluttering, and really going through those processes. It's really session by session. It really addresses each chapter in the self-help book that really covers a particular component of managing one's hoarding issues and concerns. So this particular session is focused on enhancing motivation. So we're really looking at how we can ignite, support, and promote both internal and external motivation to really begin to work on addressing cluttering issues. So we do our regular housekeeping efforts, really to make sure that we maximize the time and opportunity that we have. So for those who are unfamiliar or familiar with it, you want to use the chat or raise your hands, or you can unmute and respond to questions, concerns, or queries. You'll have the opportunity to save the chat at the end of it. Just make sure you wait until the end so you can capture the entire chat. I'm going to ask Crystal to put in the chat information for the audio call-in options, and you'll have the meeting and password as well. Ensure that if your video is on, you make sure that you have professional appearance. We want to make sure that we're focused on the subject at hand. Any questions there? So we're going to first get into review, which we do typically each month. We kind of review last month's information and really get a sense as to how people may have applied a particular learning information or strategies for that particular month that we cover. So for June's session, we really took a look at reasons for hoarding behavior and behavior patterns. So we took an opportunity to really address the reasons why people hoard. What are those internal processes, conceptions, feelings, and beliefs that really promote and sustain those kinds of hoarding concerns? And you were given some learning applications, which is an opportunity to practice those knowledge, skills, and resources that you gained from the last session. And it was really about looking at what are some of the feelings and emotions that one has to negotiate and process in an effort to really get beyond the cluttering challenge. And last month's efforts was really focused on really looking at particular possessions and assessing from your own perspective how easy it may be or challenging it may be to discard. And the objective there was for person engaging in that practice, in that experiment, so to speak, to really challenge themselves to discard an item. You identified 3 items. One that was appeared to be an easy one to discard, moderate challenge to discard, and one that was significantly challenging. And really attempt to discard those and really explore those feelings and note those feelings that come up when those attempts are being made. So, and we wanted folks to start with the easy items so they can build up some momentum and some courage and confidence, and then try to work through to the most difficult item to discard and really note and resonate with those feelings that come up. So I don't know if anyone had the opportunity to practice this particular or to work through this experiment, and what was your feedback? I mean, if anyone had the opportunity, I would certainly like to get some feedback as to how it have gone. How were you able to process that? Or the person that you're supporting, what was the feedback they gave you in terms of attempts to discard an item that's considered easy to discard, or one that is considered quite difficult to discard? Any takers? Anyone had the opportunity to try the experiment or to support someone in trying that experiment in terms of really trying to discard an item and then working through those emotions and feelings that come with your attempts? Because the objective of that particular experiment is to really get a sense of, why you save things. What are those feelings that you have to process? So Sarah says, easy item, easy to discard. And oftentimes, I think, generally speaking, we're able to kind of make that determination. A classic example is something that may be either torn, not useful, in a general sense, or something that was, perishable or something of that sort might be considered an easy item. Okay, we haven't encouraged, you haven't had the opportunity yet, but I'm sure it will be useful for the future. Great. And that's the big thing. If you haven't tried it as yet, we have, we encourage you to do so, even if it's after that particular session, because the major element of this particular learning community is to really put those strategies and efforts into practice and get some sense as to how it really is operationalized in the field. Sarah says, med item, thought of more reasons to keep, but eventually discard or discard it. Absolutely, and that's oftentimes the case. And the difficult item couldn't come up with good reasons to keep it, but it's still sitting in my house, and I'm kind of ignoring it. And we'll talk some more about really seeing things in terms of the expedient with which you need to address it, and whether or not, even if you recognize that the problem, it may not be a priority item, and therefore people can have varying perspectives about actions they want to take. And Catherine says, client had a hard time finding easy items. That's an interesting one, which sometimes we take for granted. You know, we may see it as easy. Like I said, something perishable. Like, oh, yes, throw that out. Or a dented can, right? And we know all the public health issues about that. But for someone, it may still be part of a set or part of an item that may be difficult to discard. And Erin says, our young adult family members entering a program for her binge eating disorder, and the program will also be addressing her hoarding behaviors. That's great if that's kind of an integrated approach that they're taking, because typically possessions can both be tangible as well as, you know, things internally that people hold on to. But that's great. But even if you haven't had the opportunity to try that experiment, I suggest that you do. And encourage folks to do so, because it gives you a true sense, or at least an initial sense, as to how people are resonating with those feelings that come up when you attempt to discard. So certainly look at it, and if you haven't had the opportunity as yet, certainly take the opportunity to do so and provide some feedback along the way. So we're going to continuously assess feedback from particular experimentations that we discuss. So what's our learning objectives for today? Is to really identify how someone can tell their story and wrestle with ambivalence. And it may sound rather innocuous, but it's significant for folks to be able to really tell their story and feel heard and responded to, and really address those feelings of ambivalence, or the struggle and the battle with ambivalence, and how it shows up and how it presents and what it really, how it impacts or interferes with one effort. You also want to identify personal values and how hoarding influences these values, because at the end of the day, what we've learned is that no one really is going to take action to make changes around decluttering if the things that they value the most is not impeded or impacted by hoarding, right? We all know that oftentimes really a commitment to making changes resonates with when we value something significant, and that particular impediment or that obstacle is impacting the things that we value the most. Finally, we want to describe how to test motivation through visualization exercises. So we'll talk about, you know, how someone sees that particular area that is cluttered, what feelings come up, what level of discomfort, how can they process through that, how it may be impacting them, and what they can actually gain from visualizing that particular space uncluttered and accessible and usable, and how that may shift the person's motivation or paradigm as to how they perceive their ability and confidence to really move in a direction of change that is meaningful. So it sounds like we're trying to move mountains, but no, we're trying to move pebbles around that mountain. So we'll get there. It's a slow process, but any shift is significant in that regard. So let's talk about motivation. How that impacts most of us. I mean, even in the absence of hoarding, motivation is so tricky, isn't it? I think of all the things we are motivated to do, or we tell ourselves we need to do, right? We talk about from the first day of the year, and we make those resolutions. Think of how motivation impacts our success or lack thereof as it relates to making any change. And with hoarding, it's no different. As a matter of fact, in some instances, it's more substantial. But sometimes even with the best intentions, right? Other things come up to distract us from focusing on the task at hand, right? From fatigue to other stressors or other priorities come up. So even the most highly motivated people eventually reach a point where their motivation wavers. Is that true for you, just in a general sense? You reach that point sometimes where you can't find the motivation to kind of get to the task, even though it's a priority. You put all kinds of highlights and labels on it, and and yet you can't seem to muster that energy to really get moving in that direction. I hear you, Kelly. It can certainly be a dog sometimes, so to speak, right? You can't get that movement that you want. Even though your mind is saying something, you can't get the other aspects of your being to move in the direction of change. So it's important to note that, particularly with hoarding. Motivation can change from day to day, even moment to moment. Because in some instances, even if people recognize the significance of the problem, and in some instances, luckily, some folks may feel highly motivated right away. But in other cases, it may not be that case, right? It may be the person may see something as a problem, but not necessarily see it as a high priority problem to take action. But even if in some instances recognize it as a problem, put it in a high priority, they may not know what to do, how to get that problem addressed. And even if they know what to do, sometimes they may not think they have the confidence and competence to pull it off. So there's multiple layers of challenge to motivation, because it's important not to fall prey to the belief that because it's an obvious problem, someone should be automatically motivated at the level that prompts them to action. Because as we'll talk more and more throughout this process, our interventions need to match that person's readiness and motivation for change. Because otherwise, we will be working in conflict with that person. And that, despite your best efforts and most notable skills, can be literally a fool's journey if you are not aligned properly with the level of motivation and the strategies or interventions you're using. You'll hear that as a theme as we go forward. So that's important to take note of, really, about where that person is motivationally as we begin to work in that direction, or we begin to try to support them in that effort. Absolutely, Janelle. We work better when aligned with the other. Yes. The skill of really recognizing that level of readiness and motivation is going to be critical. So let's just start with a point where we recognize the problem, right? What is going to be very important is how accurate is our perception of the severity of the hoarding problem. I'm sure if you've ever worked with someone who is experiencing hoarding as a major challenge in their life, their perception of the problem and others' perception of the problem can be vastly different and can create significant challenges to working together. So it's going to be important for people to have a sense of that. So we really want to gauge how the problem is perceived by the person experiencing that particular hoarding issues and others who may be in their lives. It's going to be important to really gauge that. And the first, we want to really ascertain how accurate is your perception if you're the person experiencing hoarding or the person you're supporting compared to others. And if you've ever attempted to do that, it can be a challenge. It's not a challenge that can't be surpassed or overcome, but it's an important one. But it's a tough question that needs to be asked. You can't avoid that. And because that's one way of conceptualizing the problem, is to determine how your perception of clutter and acquiring match up with those of other people. If you don't have that opportunity or that trust to really have that discourse, it's going to be very difficult to get people moving in a direction or to support them moving in that direction. Because you need to have that open-mindedness or that sense of, okay, others may perceive it differently in order to even sense it as a problem, right? So we have some difficult questions we have to ask. What have other people in your life told you about their perceptions of your hoarding problem, particularly family members? Because oftentimes the perception of the problem often comes through family members or other service providers who say this person has a significant problem and I don't think they are fully aware of the impact of it. So those questions at some point need to be asked. Obviously, we know we need to develop that trust, that mutual aid, mutual support first, but we need to get to this point. So those are like some of the first questions you need to ask. Have they told you that you have a lot of clutter or just a little bit of clutter? Do they think that acquiring is a problem for you? Because in some instances, as we know, the excessive possession or the large amount of possession that impedes people's ability to live in their space as they should or as desired or as designed may not simply be impacted by people collecting stuff from flea markets or wherever. It may be simply purchasing a lot of stuff that initially is thought of as useful, but then gets really overwhelming to the point where people are using that acquiring for reasons that are not aligned with their life goals and how things really operate in their lives. So these questions need to be explored. I mean, honestly and straightforward, but like I said, with a sense of caring, compassion, and empathy, but it has to be asked. Do you think your acquiring is a problem? Do you agree with the perception of your family members or the service provider that, first of all, referred you to the agency that provides support or discuss that issue with you? So these questions need to be asked. And you need to have or to find the level of courage and confidence to ask these questions, and sometimes ask them repeatedly if they're not really responded to, but in a way that really gives you a sense as to that person's perception and how it aligns or is not aligned with the other folks in their lives. And the question may simply be, do you agree or disagree with what that person say, your mom says, or your family member says? And how does it really resonate in your life? How do you feel about the dissonance or the difference in the perception of your possession or collection of possessions? Because there may actually be a significant misperception about clutter. Have you had that experience where the person you're supporting or the person in your life who's experiencing clutter really has a significant misperception about clutter? And what has that been like? Have you been able to ask those questions? And how have asking those questions really been impacted? How has it really impacted your relationship, your ability to sustain work with that person? Think of that for a moment and let me know what has been your experience like with that. Corey says, always so frustrating that they cannot see the problems. That's it. I think that's a general response, Corey. The irony of it, though, if I can say so, is that if they don't see it as a problem, is it a problem? That's the question. Janelle says, my experience is it is their memories or their worry it will bring sadness to another. That's an interesting one. Tell me more about that, Janelle. I'm trying to make sense of that. My experience is it is their memories or their worry it will bring sadness to another. Are you saying that that particular concept of it may be too worrisome for that person to even acknowledge? Trying to make sense of that. And generally speaking, how do you, if there is a clear and obvious disagreement with perception, how do you even have that discourse? Oh, Janelle said it was a gift, and the person who gave it to them may feel they are unimportant. Absolutely. We talk about perceptions and values and what make people hold on to things, right? Yes. For some folks, everything that they've received is considered so significant and so much of a value or a sense of that person that gave it to them that any attempt to discard it is tantamount to, reducing or discarding the significance of that person in your life. So it can be challenging in that regard. But has anyone had major difficulty even bringing to the forefront the discord or the disagreement with perceptions? And how has that really been, how has that impacted your relationship working with that person? Kelly says, my dad doesn't see his hoarding as a problem because every once in a great while, he's able to give a neighbor a particular screw or bolt they need. However, his garage is out of control with abundance of other things. Yes, sounds like it. And Stephanie says, the fear of failure, my client's documentations that would support him in getting better paying job and moving on is very slow process. The reality is that this is the first hurdle oftentimes that we have to get past. Because the reality is, it's not your attempt to convince that person that their perception of their possessions is a problem. It's the importance of getting them to see it's at odds with other people's perception. That's the major thing. Your perception of, the way your particular room appears is different from that of your mother. Can you understand that? Simple. It may seem like a very simple statement to make, but having that awareness, that cognizance of that's the start of it. Corey says, sometime in work, the issue comes to light to preserve housing or caregiving services. I feel like the discussion is so limited with deadlines and a sense of urgency doesn't allow for proper addressing. Oftentimes, that's a major challenge because by the time you intervene or allowed to intervene, the problem has been created, a long time ago, and it's so insurmountable that you're really, we call it behind the 8 ball, so to speak, right? But the reality is, oftentimes people who have significant hoarding problem, the major challenge with people who are trying to support them is that they're afraid to ask the questions that should be asked. Because the belief is somehow if you ask the question, you're going to lose the relationship and everything is going to, fall apart. The reality is if you don't start the relationship on a sound, honest place, the likelihood is that even if you're getting engagement, it's not meaningful, tangible, intentional enough to move in the direction of change. Does that make sense? That's important. It's that concept of, I see it in the same way, like the first time that child acts out in the supermarket, right? And you act like they're not doing anything in order for them not to continue to act out, and then someone else have to deal with that when they take him to the supermarket because no one ever said, hold on a minute. Screaming and hollering in the supermarket is not okay. You may not have the answer as to how to fix it, but at least you need to acknowledge that there is a problem. And Janelle says, change is hard for me when it is forced on me. I think change is hard for any one of us when it's forced upon us, right? Change has to be something that we have a value for, we see the benefit of, and we feel committed to doing. Otherwise, it's not change. It's someone else's dictate. Very significant in that sense. That's great. Thanks for feedback. But like I said, the most important element is to find the courage to at least put it out there, non-judgmentally. I look at the case of, you talk about if the dad is worse. Dad, I don't know if you're aware of this. But when your feedback about, the way this room seems a little different from the other folks in the family. Is that something you're aware of? Because that person may not even be aware of it because everyone around them may not have the courage to actually say that. So sometimes you may be the first person that's actually breaking the ice on that issue. Hey, your perception of your home and the space and the clutter is very different from what the person who inspected the house has. I want you to know that. How do you feel about that? What is that like? How do you experience that? Starts a conversation. Person may be like, well, I don't give a hoot about what they think. This is not their house. But at least you got the conversation started, right? And that person cannot say that you don't have a difference of perception about the issue. Because like I said, it isn't an issue if you don't bring it up. If it's not discussed, it's not an issue. Aaron says executive functioning problems and fear of being abandoned. Their perception is that their nest means safety. And there's lots of different values and principles and reasons for maintaining possessions. I mean, we can spend the rest of the year talking about, the reasons people have, but some of them, like we said, can be actually addressed to prompt some kind of action, or at least a sense of how that person perceives it. So it's important to really gauge initially the perception of the problem from all the parties involved, or at least the people involved, so that you're having a place to start with. And so that person can know it's a misperception about at the time, right? You have to give that person some sense of how the rest of the world is seeing things, or the people involved in their lives are seeing things. And there's a worksheet really that we use, which is comparing your perceptions with those of others. So if you're not able to have that conversation in vivo, this can be homework that a person can actually have if you feel that that person is able to really just assess it in their own space, in their own time. And it really has some provocative questions that really ask, to what extent do you currently have a problem with collecting free things or buying more things that you need or can use or can afford? And that person has an option of, on that Likert scale, really giving you some feedback from no problem to an extreme problem. Because what we find oftentimes when people have the opportunity to really sit with their thoughts about things, they may be able to actually give you an accurate description. Does not mean they're ready for action, but they can be honest about it without ready to take any action to change. Yes, Janelle, this worksheet will be, we can certainly send it to you. It's going to be part of the providership, but we can send you this worksheet. Crystal, if we have it, can we add, I don't know if we have, we can add it to the chat.
Yes, I just shared
PDF. Thank you. So, and these are the questions also you can use to kind of engage and to prompt that conversation. Because for some people, like we know, don't give me any homework, any charts. I don't want you writing anything down because I don't know what you're going to do with that information, right? How many of you have had that kind of response? Where someone says, I'm not right, don't write anything down because you're not going to get me in trouble with the housing authority. If you write it down as evidence, but you maybe use this scale, you can use this particular worksheet as a prompt for you to ask the questions to get some feedback. But it's really a great way of really looking at it in terms of perceptions. So check it out, we'll give it to you. And you can see when may be a good time to use it, because it may be at varying points of your discourse or engagement that you may be able to use it. Because for some people, it's really in the initial phases, And whereas for other folks, it may be at a point where they maybe have made some initial progress and then they're stymied or there's a little stagnation. And then this may give them an opportunity to kind of gauge things as to where it is and where they would like it to be. So it can be used at varying points. And it's important to follow up if there's a great deal of misperceptions here, and ask some tough questions. How many of you are okay with asking the tough questions? I said the questions are only tough if you struggle. with asking them. You know, that whole concept, we always impose stuff. Oh, it's a difficult question for that person to answer. I said, how do you know that if you haven't asked it? Right? So sometimes we tend to project that discomfort and uncertainty onto the client or onto the person or onto the family member because we have a discomfort, because we start predicting what their answers are going to be, and then we are not ready to ask the question because we don't want to have any discord in the relationship. But tough questions need to be asked, because oftentimes the hoarding problem can be pivotal enough as to whether someone can maintain their housing or not, or it can be a health-related issue, a public health issue. So it's so significant and tangible and sometimes critical that we need to be ready to ask those tough questions. I always say, you can always repair the relationship, but you can't change it if you started out first with either avoidance, lies, or discomfort. Because once that person doesn't see you have the confidence, it's very difficult for them to feel confident in the relationship and then confident in themselves to really take action. And some of the tough questions are pivotal. Do I view my possessions differently from how others view them? So instead of asking that question from that perspective of what they've heard other people say, you can ask them to internalize it and ask them, how do they view it? And does that view differ from the perspective of others? How about the significance or the value of usefulness of the items, of the object? Someone holding on to I think of it like a saw that is rusted, hasn't been used in 20 years, bent, it just can't, cut anything in a straight line, and the significance of that utility. And ask the question, has saving things to the extent that you currently do improve your life? Because I don't know how many of you may have come across that person says, I'm holding on to everything that I got from my niece or from my sister. And then you ask the question, so how is the relationship with your sister? When is the last time you've seen her? Oh, I haven't seen her in 10 years, but everything she's given me the last 10 years, I have to hold on to. Because whenever we start talking again, I want her to know that I have maintained the value of everything she's given me. Now, from your perspective, is it about the possessions or is it about the relationship that that person needs to solidify? Think of that for a moment. Because what we often do sometimes is everything becomes related to hoarding, right? We tend to almost impose a life of its own to hoarding and not really look at things otherwise. The relationship, it's important because you may want to ask the person, hold on a minute. Why are you not in an active, engaging, mutually rewarding relationship with your sister? And what is that about? And how does hoarding impact that? Because oftentimes you may process that and do a chain analysis and realize that it went awry when the sister said, I'm not coming back here because I can't find a place to sit. We can't have dinner like we used to, a cup of tea like we used to, because there's no place to sit. I can't find a cup of tea. I can't find a cup to have some tea. So sometimes it means working on the relationship, and working on that relationship may actually inspire the person to make some changes to the environment, because the environment may be the impediment to the sustainability of that relationship. So tough questions need to be asked to really challenge those misperceptions. And then you can go back to one of the tools that we use, one of the instruments that we use. Are your daily activities impaired by hoarding in chapter 3 that we discussed? How much of your life is restricted by your clutter or hoarding? And that's what I talk about in terms of oftentimes when someone has that significant of a problem, the relationships in their life may be actually significantly impacted by that. And they don't want to acknowledge it, or no one has ever connected those two things. How important it is to you to reclaim those parts of your life? Now, that is probably one of the most pivotal questions that you can ask someone. you know, reclaiming those parts of their lives that they value that may have been lost as a consequence of the hoarding challenge, that they may not connect with that. You know, a person goes from having a number of friends and the entertaining aspect of their social life to no social life at all. But they've continuously made excuses that they're not well or they can't, you know, today's not a good day. You know, the long list of rationalization not to come into my house, right? But no one is asking the questions. Have you lost out on those social aspects of your life? And how do you think hoarding relates to that? Now, they may literally says, oh, people want to come in and tell me how to live my life. So I keep them out of my house because this is my house. And you may want to probe beyond that. So, but the questions need to be asked, and there's certainly some instruments and tools that can really help do that from an objective standpoint. And then you certainly want to go back to, are you ready to change? Because that's the major objective here, is to really ascertain whether or not that person is ready and committed and realize the need to make some changes. Person may not feel the same way. Has your readiness for change really shifted since a particular point? Really to get to those hallmarks, those benchmarks, and really ask those questions, really promote that kind of discussion. Janelle says, it's difficult when they feel threatened and become hostile in defense. That may be true, but I'm going to ask anyone to make a substantial life change. Doesn't it require some level of shifting, some level of addressing fear and concern? The reality is, at some point, those issues have to be raised and oftentimes addressed. And yes, if that person's feel threatened and that's the feedback you're getting, there's ways of mitigating that. You know, listen, this is really about determining whether or not the perception or misperception exists. It's not about determining whether you're a good person, bad person, or somehow it's your fault while you're hoarding. This is really about ascertaining from you, how do you view your perception and how do you compare it with others, and what is that about? So there's the thing about addressing hoarding is it's difficult. There are difficult conversations, and you have to exemplify and model confidence and competence to espouse that to the other person so that they can be. That's not to say that you have the greatest level of confidence. Confidence means that they're going to make change, you know, lickety split. It's going to take some time, but significant changes in your life require being able to look outside of yourself and seeing someone who says, yes, you can do it. And having a sense that there is that level of support and commitment externally. Does that resonate? Does that make sense? Can you see these things really supporting that effort? Really having that person look back at their daily activities impaired by hoarding, or their readiness to change, really looking at those two things. Because as we know, a person will not make the change until they see it as valued and significant to their lives. Nothing we say or do is going to make that shift in paradigm of thinking until it's really embedded in their mind that I can benefit from making this change. I am capable of making this change. If my efforts initially to make attempting to make this change falter, it's not the end of the line. I can dust myself up and get up and start again. This is incremental. It's not a win-lose. It's not a really getting past those cognitive distortions and really getting into a sense that there's more gray addressing hoarding than there is black and white. Gina says, ascertaining the perception of your space and what is that and what is important. Said in a quiet tone, the other person is scared in a manner I do not understand. Yeah, oftentimes it's intonation, it's timing. It's how that question really connects to another activity. So it's really nuance. And we talk about the significance of nuance in addressing hoarding. So what questions would you like to ask someone in that regard? Think of some of the questions that may come up that really addresses perceptions to that extent. For me, it's always been, have you heard or accepted or even resonate with another person's perception about the way you collect and maintain your items? Have you opened your ears or mind to hearing another person's perspective? And the answer may be an unequivocal, hell no, I don't. And that's all right. Because then you can follow up question by asking, is there any aspect of your life where you take that same possession or position? Is this primarily associated with hoarding, or are there other aspects of your life that you really close the door on other people's perception? You get a sense of that? You're really talking about how that person is seeing hoarding in relation to the full scheme of their lives. Because if we hold hoarding in a protected corner, guess what that person is going to do? And Corey will tell you, what will that person do? If you put it in a corner and you act like you have to skate around it, guess what that person is going to do? They'll likely do exactly that. If you dance around it, if you do a waltz around it, they will do a jig around it. That's the reality. Sometimes you have to break the ice or break the concept of this is a safe place to actually feel upset or to experience to experience things differently. Absolutely, Corey. Shut down, avoid, and no progress. Yes. And before you know it, you both are on the same page. Going backwards very quickly. Down a descent. So do you get the resonating message here? I want to make sure that the theme is being focused on. Misperceptions or perceptions about things need to be brought to the forefront. You can't hide it. It's okay if it's initially taken a little, tough, but there's some perseverance. And you can develop a skill of being nuanced in asking the questions, using different tools, different approaches to getting people to really look at it. Because it starts with perception. And that allows the person to then have the opportunity to tell their story. Because I can tell you, hoarding is a story. It really, people have a specific memory as to how things unfolded or may have none at all. And sometimes you need to really ignite or dig up the old skeletons of the story for people to even begin to look to see the connections that occur. Because when making a major life change, it may be helpful to review what brought you to the current situation. And there's some questions that really help people gauge that, analyze that, what brought them to the current situation, in order for them to look at things in vivo, look at things in the moment, look at things prospectively, respectively. When did this problem begin? And you may be startled that the person may be able to either tell you an event or a circumstance or a time in their lives when they first either acknowledge or recognize that their possessions were out of hand. Or someone may say, I don't know, but I think it may be A, B, C, D, and that process of really finding the courage to even explore their life sphere or life events to determine the commencement of the hoarding problem may be pivotal in helping them understand it. When did it get out of control? How have your family and friends reacted to this situation? Are there major life events or trauma associated with this? What things have you lost out on because of clutter and hoarding? What has been your experience or experiences asking these questions, processing these questions? What do you think would be a pivotal question for the person you're currently serving or the person that you're trying to support. Which one of these questions you think will really spur probably the most significant conversation, or will probably, as Janelle says, create the most sense of feeling threatened? Just think of these questions. Because maybe we can take a few minutes to really process the feedback and the potential shift or ways of adjusting or modifying the question to suit your particular circumstance. If you can't, just think first of when did this problem begin? That may be a good place to start. For instance, for quite a few, they report the death of a parent and then inheriting all of their things. Thank you, Corey, for sharing that. That is spot on. Because think of that. I call that almost like the quintessential piling on, right? That's literally, and oftentimes people can't process through those multiple cascading events that can be very traumatizing. Because if you haven't even been able to process the loss and how it impacts your life, think of acquiring all these things. Because now, not only do you have to deal with the loss of the person, you now become somehow the, there's a name for it, where everything that person possesses almost becomes like an artifact, and you become almost like the family keeper of all things. That can be immensely challenging. Jill says, my basement. Stephanie says, my client continuously bring up the original story, but wouldn't move past the victim's mentality, so he's stuck in pre-contemplation. That is an interesting perspective, Stephanie. That the person brings up the original story, but won't move past the victim's mentality. I would ask you to probably look at it from the perspective of, instead of perceiving it potentially as a victim's mentality, which we can look at, but in some ways it's more looking at this from a problem perspective, kind of a pathological perspective, as opposed to the person can't get past that hurt, right? Because oftentimes if you relay it that way, the person can see it then as an internal feeling or emotion that they can process. Like, it seems like you can't get past that hurt. You're kind of in that space of hurt. Is there a way that you think you can, process that hurt? And Chris says, I think people become defensive because there's a history of disrespect for their possessions, especially from loved ones. Absolutely. And you think of it, if these possessions now become the source of all things that you are associated with that person that you lost, if the possession become your way of grieving, that's your part of bereavement. That's how you grieve. If you don't find a meaningful, instrumental, beneficial way of grieving, then that becomes the things you hold on to, right? And not only did you inherit the possessions, because I think of it, it's not just inheriting the possessions. You're inheriting the possessions and the problems and the emotions that can't be addressed. It then becomes almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. I've lost that person and everything else is associated with loss. I'm fearful that if I let go or discard any of these items, I'm going to lose the relationship with that person. I'm going to lose the significance of that person. I'm going to lose those things. So it's important to really assess the meaning that person is attaching to the item and the purpose and the reason for maintaining that association. And is there a way to cope with that? Are they really processing that grief? Or are they using the item to kind of stay in that grieving process, to stay stuck in it, intentionally or unintentionally? But those are important elements. Like I said, this is probably the most pivotal aspect of really engaging in that conversation about promoting and initiating change. What brought you to this current state, and where do you want to be? And what about where you are is going to impact your ability to move to where you want to be? Sometimes the most difficult question to ask someone is, what things have you lost out on because of clutter? And I'll tell you why. Oftentimes we can be afraid of the answer. Because if the person answer is, I don't think I've lost out on anything, you kind of set yourself up for a great a disconnect, right? And that can be tremendously anxiety provoking. Because if the person says, oh, what are you talking about? I haven't lost anything, then you're stuck. Because then the person is saying to you, this is not a problem. This is your problem. It's not mine. So sometimes before asking this question, you have to have a sense of that person's history. So you can bring them back to, hold on a minute. When we first start having this conversation, you talked about the importance of having, your girlfriends or your cousins or nephews or whomever was in your life, how you miss their company and miss their support. I'm not trying to question your honesty, but it's important for you to recognize that I heard two different things at two different times. Tell me about that. What has changed since you told me the first time that your social life is very important to you, and losing that really shifted the way you perceive yourself? Do you get that? Is that something that you can see occurring? Because sometimes, like I said, we can have unconscious fear of posing certain questions because it's about our discomfort that we can impose on someone else by not asking the question, and that resulting us not asking the question. So in some sense, you have to have almost not a rebuttal for the potential answers, but prepared to say, oh, okay, I'm kind of surprised by that, right? You have to have that built-in answer or response. I'm kind of surprised. Maybe help me understand. Is it me that forgot what you said? Is it my memory, or did you say something and it the way you perceive it is different now? Because you can always bring it back to that. But really allowing that person to tell their story, oftentimes through some gentle questioning or guidance, can really give you a sense as to how that person perceives it, because it then becomes easy to help that person harken back to the event, the trauma, or the significant occasion that resulted in this kind of becoming perpetual and building on its own. Person, the other person may say, I never had these problems before my mother died. And since my mom passed away, I can't seem to make sense as to, how I keep adding things to my home or my garage or my living room. Or my mom and I spent a lot of time in her room, and I just kept all her possessions in that room because I don't want, and this may seem bizarre to you, I don't want her spirit to be disrupted. I want all her possessions to be in her space, because I go there and I visit with her. I go there and I really process with my mom. So there may be cultural elements to that. There may be way of, grieving or mourning that may have cultural significance that may speak to having to maintain certain things in certain places. So you don't want to be totally ignorant or oblivious to that person's cultural element that may have a significance, because you don't want to be like, well, why are you holding those things in that thing, without even asking, is there some specific cultural or other significance to you maintaining that stuff in that particular space or dealing with things that way? Because once again, people mourn differently in different cultures. Important to keep that caveat in mind. So telling the story is extremely important because it gives you a framework from whence to initiate those discussions or start those difficult questions, or a process from where to start so that you can come back as a point of reference to ask the person, has their perception or feelings or mood improved over time? So it's a good place to really give you a great point of reference and also give that person an opportunity to be heard, understood, and appreciated for all the things outside of simply hoarding being a problem. And it may be important for you to ask that person to tell their story. Can you tell me how you got here? How do you think you got here? Or what if, people that know you think about why you got here? And how does that correlate? Do you agree with that? Because I hear your brother constantly saying that, from the time your mom died, things went downhill. Does that make sense to you? Can you see the connection? Can you process things that way? Important questions to ask. So we're going to go to break if you don't mind, because we have just about 25 minutes or so. So unless someone absolutely needs a break, if you need a bathroom break, you can take it. But I want to make sure that we are kind of staying on track. Do you agree? See, if I said, do you agree, then that's a pointed question. That's a pointed question, right? I can't ask the question. I need to be setting a good example. Would you like to take a break or not? Okay. Well, Janelle says yes. Someone says no, no, no. And this is where democracy comes in, right? A quick potty break. Okay, so the fact that I've gotten 2 people who say quick potty break will give people, how about let's do 5 minutes? All right, 5 minutes potty break, and then we'll get back to it. All righty. Now, let's get right back to it. And I see Kimberly. I see on Amazon the 3rd edition of the book. Is there an advantage to getting that first, 2nd edition? Not that I know of specifically. Quite honestly, I have to be forthright with you. I haven't really completely reviewed the entire 3rd edition, so I would say the real concrete self-help element is in the 2nd edition. So the 2nd edition may be the most prudent one to get at this point. Hopefully that's helpful. All right. So we want to certainly really look at the importance and the significance of ambivalence in this process. It's probably one of the most prominent states of affairs during this process. It is important to recognize that you'll probably, particularly the person experiencing the hoarding challenge, may feel conflicted about changing the way they acquire and save possessions, because it takes a great deal of time to get to this state. So it's a challenge for people to not feel conflicted by that process of being challenged to discard things. So most people who hoard really experience sometimes intractable ambivalence, or ambivalence that it's difficult to kind of shake. What's important to note here, though, is that ambivalence is not the same as apathy. Therefore, we can't take that position that the behavior that you're seeing or resonating with is apathetic, in a sense that apathy means that one simply doesn't care at all about the problem. Whereas on the other hand, when we're looking at people who are ambivalent, we're really referring to the fact that you may have opposing beliefs or feelings at the same time. A good example is that that person may wish to clear the clutter, but feel reluctant to part with their possessions. So in essence, there's really nothing wrong with being ambivalent. It is what happens with recognizing and processing that ambivalence that's going to be pivotal. People need to face that ambivalence. It's natural and normal, and everyone experiences it, and it's especially for those folks who are dealing with hoarding, right? The conflicting needs, the wants, and the values may be very different. It's going to be critical and important that people attempt to face ambivalence head on and work through it with the, some of the exercises, particularly some of the experimentation and some of the processes and strategies that we speak about in this particular book that we're using, the self-help book, right? To really explore both sides of ambivalence. You know, you wish to clear the clutter and you're reluctant to part with your things. How many of you have come experienced that, have gotten feedback to that sort, to that element, where someone says, you know, I want to do this and that's the first sign when someone is really ambivalent. When someone says, when and becomes a conjunction, do this and that, right? Have two different feelings and they may be opposing. What has been your experience like with someone in that state of ambivalence that you can't seem to shake them from? You can't, because you can actually, you know, want to hold on to the possession to some extent and honor that value of that possession. But the rate at which things have accumulated, you can't hold on to everything, right? You have to discard something in order to give that one space. I think of it, probably the most easy way of dealing with that is when you speak to the person's capacity to store all those things, space, and how it impacts functioning in the apartment or in the home. You know, it's, I think of it, and you know me, I'm going to always share in that sense that I have moved a lot. And I think every time I moved, I think I bought a different set of pots and pans. And I spend a lot of time in the kitchen. I'm the cook in my home. I rustle up something. So I know for a fact that I bought these what is it? The non-stick pans. And I've got about, I'm gonna be honest with you, I think I've got 5 non-stick skillets. Now, there's no way I'm cooking 5 different meals at the same time. I need 5 skillets, right? I really, honestly, can benefit from 2 good ones. Because I've got some with some scratches, and guess what I don't do? But I haven't done yet. The one with the scratches, my eggs stick, and I know that, but I'm like, oh, it's so cute. And it matches the red one that I have. So if I get rid of this skillet, I don't have to, you know, it's gonna mismatch for the rest of the set, right? Have you experienced that? Tell me I'm not alone. Janelle says there are different sizes. You would not believe the difference between an 8-inch skillet and a 10-inch skillet. Very different. Substantially different. If you're obsessed as I am with that omelet fitting the right plate. I'm English, so we've got plate for everything. And it's got to fit the right plate. My omelet can't be the size of a dinner plate. My breakfast omelet needs to fit on the breakfast plate. Brenda says, like, I'm telling you, Brenda, the truth sets you free. You've got to start with it. And believe you me, I've heard different perceptions. I've heard, my wife says, Earl, really? Can't you just pull the eggs in so that they fit? Why do you have to have a pan that's specific to that? I'll get there. Last week, I got rid of 2. I said someone at Goodwill will make better omelets because of my contribution and donation. Proper fitting omelette, right? Good size. So yes, we have to acknowledge our own space. We have to start from our own space. It's not outrageous for someone to think about that. You have to process it. And Janelle says we use different pans for cooking different eggs. Absolutely. So yes, but sometimes it's getting to that point where, listen, you only have so much cupboard space. You can't keep 4, 5 different pans of the same sort. So sometimes we have to help that person face the ambivalence head on and then process through it. Because the and or the but can actually be processed. Because what we've learned in time, particularly in human services, that anytime someone gives a statement that starts with a whole, phrase first and then have but, what happens after the but? Come on, I know I've got a bunch of smart people in this. Like, what happens when someone, anything that it says after the but, what does it do to the thing that they said former or prior to the but? They absolutely said rationalization, the denial, a contradiction, right? So sometimes just changing the diction, changing the words can make a difference. When someone says, but I can't get rid of, do you mean and? You also want to secure and safeguard your prized possession? Yes. Because if you use and, it means you can actually look at it honestly. Because the but means shut down. The but means don't go beyond that point. So and means that there's some scope for this discourse about it. Krista's housemate gripes about my different size skillets. Meanwhile, he has about a dozen guitars. Yes, sometimes hypocrisy is a good place to start, right? Hey, that doesn't make sense when you're questioning my skillet when you have 15 guitars. And we know the guitar players will tell you, well, this one is tuned very differently. But it's important. The importance here is to face the ambivalence, to help that person really look at it head on and work through the exercises, particularly for addressing ambivalence. They're there, they're consistent. And there's some ways of doing that. There's the balance of change scale, where we explore reasons for change and reasons not to change. And I think if you've done any of the training with us around just our general service, we look at, when we're doing readiness for change, the people's reasons for change and people's reasons for not changing, right? Maintaining the status quo, we look at that. I like that, Chris, because at least my pants fit in the cupboard. Fine. But it's important to explore those reasons. Clutter is hurting my social life, right? Or a person says, my clutter is not doing anything for me. I'm good. I had 5 friends and I still have the same 5 friends. So there's ways of looking at the balance of change scale to really help that person explore and review their reasons for keeping things status quo, their reasons for changing. And this is a good scale to use, particularly when someone may be having some challenges or difficulty, really exploring things in a discourse, in a dialogue. It may be a lot easier for that person to really look at it in their own space, in their own time, in their own scheme without outside noise, right? Look at your reasons for change. You can ask the person, hey, take the opportunity to really use this chart and we'll explore, 2 or 3 good reasons for change, 2 or 3 good reasons for staying status quo, and see, whether or not there's a point to which you can shift. Because what you want to do is tip the scales towards the reasons for change. Help that person shift the paradigm a little. And sometimes you need to look with your current relationship with that person, where is the scales being tipped? Because if every time that person gives you a strong, firm argument for not changing and you back away and you avoid it, it's really tipping things in a direction that may not be efficacious or change driven. One of the ways of doing that is really look at the personal goals, how their goals align with their reasons for either changing or staying the same. List the things you most value. If the person values family, friendship, and so forth, then the importance of having a space to accommodate that kind of social engagement may be significant enough for you to say, hey, is hoarding affecting your ability to socialize with your close family members? What are their goals for actually working on specific interventions or specific strategies for uncluttering or decluttering? The person may want to beat hoarding because they're sick of people nagging them, or they're concerned about losing their housing, getting evicted. You know, it may be health concerns. I've had numerous falls. This may be a fire hazard. I may not be able to get to or can't cook. I have diabetes and the doctor's recommending that I eat a certain way, but I can't cook because my kitchen is overwhelmed with possessions. And then you certainly want to explore, if you work on the hoarding problems, what are some of the things that will likely happen? People have to have pointed, clear, definitive, instrumental goals that they can see as achievable, and changing something that is of value to them, bringing them to a place where they meet a value that they are really significantly own. So what working on hoarding will do for you? How does hoarding influence values, interfere with them, or enhance the things that they value the most? It's a critical element to really discuss before going any further. Sometimes you need to just stop and really address those value-based and goal-based questions. It may be very helpful to answer some of those simple questions to help determine how hoarding influences or interferes with that person's, the things that they value the most in their lives. And we talk about having the difficult discussion. One of the ways of doing that is really utilizing this tool of the clutter visualization or unclutter visualization. If you had a chance to read the reference, it's a clear part where you really want, it's an exercise where you really ask that person to go into that area that is cluttered and really take a look at it. And notice and note the feelings that come up, right? What's the level of discomfort from a scale of 0 being no discomfort to 10 extreme discomfort? How do you feel when you look at that space that is cluttered? And you want to look at all angles, take them around that whole space. And then note on this particular scale, what are some of those emotions and the rate and the level and degree of those emotions? What feelings were you having while you look around the room? What thoughts or beliefs you were having while you look around the room? Person may say, I feel so disgusted by what I see, or I never thought it was this significant. Now that I've looked at it with you standing here, it has a different perception to me, or I feel differently. Then you ask that person to try to visualize the room with the clutter gone, and ask them to take an inventory of their emotions in relation to visualizing that room with the clutter gone. What can you see yourself doing in that room if there's no clutter? Can you recall what was there before it got to this point? Start thinking about, where would you put your coffee table? Where would you put the chair that you like the most, that big comfy chair? Where would that fit? Can you begin to even almost like redecorate that room in your head? And how does that impact your emotional state? How do you see yourself futuristically enjoying that space? So really aligning motivation with the values things that the person values the most with the motivation that it's going to take to achieve that state of affairs. And finally, we were asking that person to really contract with themselves to do the work or to approach really living those values in relation to the cluttering challenge. Because what we've learned is that people tend to stick to a plan best when it's made clear and has a formal declaration of intent. It is exactly the reason why we recommend that people sign an agreement with themselves. Because what we know is that when you sign an agreement with yourself, it's reinforcing or reiterating the fact that you are the most responsible and accountable to yourself. Because if you can't make that commitment to yourself, it's very difficult to make commitment with someone else. What we ask, though, if the person is able to kind of sign that contract, is if they have a trusted, loved person that really supports them, to give that person a copy, but help that kind of external support, that kind of agreement to really begin to do the work. Because subsequent to this, we're beginning to look at what is the work that needs to be done to make the shift from cluttered to uncluttered to decluttered. So we start with that motivational element, really getting that person to visualize the space uncluttered, take into consideration and acknowledge what it's going to take to do that, but why it's so valuable and important to them. So that when they formulate goals for decluttering or uncluttering, it's visualized, it's intrinsic to them, it's value-based, it aligns with where they are, where they see themselves, and they can see the tangible benefits of doing so. And this really spells out what is going to be done and what kind of commitment that person is going to make. And making that promise to yourself to do the work. Can anyone see this contract being a very tangible tool to use with someone who is in that process of shifting from preparation to action? That person has spoken the readiness terms, right? You've evoked that kind of change language, and now you're helping that person prepare for the change action by contracting to do the work. Place you can come back to and say, this is what you committed to. I'm trying to help you stick with your plan, your contract, your commitment. This is what you actually solicited my help to support you through or with. So can you see yourself utilizing this contract with the people or the loved ones that you're working with or supporting through the process, and understand its importance and value in sustainability in terms of the person's effort and motivation to do the work? And there's lots of ways in terms of really helping to motivate other people. That's going to be important. And we give some tips as to how you can really have those conversations. So I think it works if the person does follow contracts. If the person is usually late for appointments, usually wanting others to do them, it may not help. And so it can be challenging, but what you can certainly use the contract and kind of, I would say, preface it with, this contract is changeable, it's something that we can revisit. We can modify it as we go along. This contract is to serve you as a guide, so you can come back to it. If with your permission, I can prompt you and remind you of the things that you value, the things that you committed to. But this contract is not for me to use as a measuring stick for your efforts. So you get that kind of guideline and nuance. It's important to establish that with the contract. Because you never want the person to believe this contract is about you watching them and measuring their efforts or lack thereof. It's really a tool for them to use, but it's something that you can really guide with. Give that person choice. What's important in terms of having this initial conversation is to show empathy. Open-ended questions, summarize understanding, reflect back meaning, compliment, appreciate, really develop that trusting relationship, really work on the relationship building elements of it. Avoid the arguing. Matter of fact, don't get engaged in arguing. No ordering, no directives, persuading with logic, moralizing, preaching. This is about really speaking to those elements. Respect autonomy. Person has the right to make those decisions. It's their goals. Ask about their goals. See how it fits with their values. Decide what you can and cannot tolerate. So you have a sense as to when things get tough, why that person's experiencing that challenge with getting past the hurt or getting past that blockade of an emotion. So these are some of the tools that, it's available to you when someone is in that stage. It's important for us to really tweak and continue to work on the motivation. And I know we're running short on time, so if you have a minute or two, I want you to, if you can't, complete the evaluation. So give us some feedback as to how you see this particular training impacting your day-to-day, and how do you see some of the tools we've discussed being incorporated into your efforts to support and guide someone in the process towards decluttering. And I want to thank you sincerely, certainly, for engaging, for working through this process. This is not easy, but the evidence has shown that this is viable. It's tangible. It's evidence-based in terms of helping people through the process of recognizing the need for change and working through those changes that bring value and concept to the need to change and the reason for changing and the importance of making the change and decluttering so that they can live life to their fullest and regain or at least sustain some level of quality of life that they're due and they desire. That's what all our efforts are really motivated to doing. And in some of those cases, I always say the extra bonuses mean helping someone save their housing, maintain their housing, stay healthy, stay within their community, maintain a lifestyle that they desire. Those are extra bonuses. So once again, certainly thank you very much for engaging. We look forward to meeting with you next month. Next month, we're really going to be focused on some other elements of the efforts here. We have the learning community, the learning application that we ask that you practice, which is using the comparing your perception with others tools and the personal goal worksheet and the clutter and unclutter visualization elements, and really providing some feedback as to how it went, how we'll be able to really address that. And our next session is really going to be, as I said, the action phase of things, reducing, acquiring, really beginning to work on discarding and working on shifting that paradigm and shifting those efforts towards really discarding stuff. And it's some of the strategies for doing that when there is some emotional challenges to doing so. I remember you're already registered, so there's the same link. Look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you once again, and have a great rest of the week. Absolutely, Corey. Well,
thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. You're quite welcome, my dear. Take good care of yourself, and we'll see you guys next month. And for those who are on vacation, we'll make sure you get the information shared to you, and we'll see you when you get back. All right. Bravo, Leona.